Good evening, and welcome to tonight's special event presented by the MPC Great Books program and made possible by the generosity and commitment of our angel, the Apgar Foundation. I am David Clemens, MPC Great Books program coordinator. I want to thank the Monterey County Weekly for its valuable support and to recognize the indispensable contributions of Rich Montori, Jeanette Haxton, Michelle Brock, Rosa Arroyo, and the MPC Humanities Division. If you are one of our colloquium subscribers, you know that our first speaker, Mark Edmondson, was forced to reschedule due to his mother's illness. When the new date is set in the spring, there will be publicity, and if you want to leave your email address, I will notify you. If you already have a ticket, you can hold on to it, but you may also have a refund if you so choose. Tonight, I am delighted to bring you Zachary Mason, author of The Lost Books of the Odyssey. Homer's Odyssey stands at the dawn of Western literature and, as Wilfred Maclay says, shimmers with the dew of morning. Homer's protean conception of Ulysses' journey home seems inexhaustible, essential, and unsurpassable. The epic has been translated into English dozens of times over hundreds of years, from George Chapman, Alexander Pope, and T.E. Lawrence, to Robert Fitzgerald, Richmond Lattimore, Robert Fagles, Alan Mandelbaum, and Stanley Lombardo. Homer has inspired stories, poems, and plays by others as well, from Nathaniel Hawthorne and Alfred Lord Tennyson to James Joyce, Nikos Kazantzakis, and Derek Walcott. Zach Mason's book thus joins a distinguished literary company. The Times Literary Supplement declares Mason's as, quote, perhaps the most revelatory and brilliant prose encounter with Homer since James Joyce, end quote. I first read The Lost Books on a cross-country flight and then heard poet Tess Taylor's paper on this enchanting book at a conference in Princeton. Tess said, like Penelope, Mason also crafts an unfinishable tapestry. This, Mason seems to argue, is the point. Because the tale lives on in our culture, it remains receptive to our remaking. Therefore, Mason remakes and remakes. Classics often suffer the double blow of seeming at once dusty and also imbibed to the point of cliché. But in an era when people like to repeat that the story is dead, books are dead, even history itself is dead, it is wonderful to discover a book in which a story is so pulsingly alive. She continues, the rediscovered tales he proposes are wildly inventive. In one, a soldier named Odysseus escapes after the Trojan War to become a wandering bard. That ex-soldier travels island to island composing poems about a soldier called Odysseus. In another, Paris is also a name for the king of the dead, and Menelaus's attack on Troy is really an attack on the kingdom of death. In another, Odysseus goes down to the underworld to find Penelope, but she no longer recognizes him and sees only a person named No Man. Using familiar elements as recombinant puzzle parts, Mason, like some fabulous Penelope, enters and then reweaves the old tales. But wait, as the TV pitchmen like to say, there's more. Zach is not an Oxford Don or classics scholar, but rather a computer theorist with special interest in artificial intelligence. He is a Silicon Valley native who attended Bard College at Simon's Rock and received his doctorate from Brandeis. His thesis was titled A Computational Corpus-Based Metaphor Extraction System, which sounds like a fusion of Thomas Pynchon, Jorge Luis Borges, and J.G. Ballard. The New York Times says that Zach approaches literature almost as if it were a branch of science, governed by laws that are quantifiable and predictable, quoting Zach as saying, what I'm interested in scientifically is understanding thought with computational precision. I mean, the romantic idea that poetry comes from this deep, inarticulable stuff is a nice idea, but I think it is essentially false. I think the mind is articulable and the heart probably knowable. Unless you're a mystic and believe in a soul, which I don't, you really don't have any other conclusion you can reach besides that the mind is literally a computer. Zach, then, represents a striking contrast with Claire Cavanaugh, who a few weeks ago claimed that the lyric poem acted as a form of subversive political resistance in Eastern Europe because the lyric presumes that we each have a solitary, private, and unique inner being, which determinist, mechanist, and collectivist governments cannot tolerate, since such a unitary self lies beyond the reach and control of the state. In other words, for Cavanaugh, essential human qualities and experience involve mystery and transcend what is observable, measurable, or knowable. However, in Zach's expert and professional view, all our celebrated works of art, music, and literature can be understood as the results of computation, and romantic words such as inspiration or genius or spirit are just human vanities featuring a distorting homocentrism. Perhaps the oldest and most enduring question in artificial intelligence research is whether what we call consciousness is an illusion or simply something that emerges when a computational system attains sufficient brute processing power. You may be familiar with the math computing professor Werner Vinge's term technological singularity, that moment brought on by the exponential growth of computer processing power, when artificial processing power equals and then recursively self-improving surpasses human processing power. He calls that event, quote, an intellectual transition as impenetrable as the knotted space-time at the center of a black hole, when the world will pass far beyond our understanding. In 1993, Vinge predicted that, quote, within 30 years, we will have the technological means to create superhuman intelligence. Shortly after, the human era will be ended, unquote. So you can see how Zach's meditations and investigations embody a remarkable combination of creative and literary achievement, scientific and technical expertise, and philosophical courage. Since he was a late addition to our speakers list this year, he was not imagined as part of the colloquium on imaginative freedom and political freedom, but it seems to me that he will have very cogent, deeply informed, and provocative things to say about that subject as well. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Zachary Mason.
This is the preface. Despite its complexity, a handful of images are central to the Odyssey. Black ships drawn up on a white beach, a cannibal ogre guarding a cave mouth, a man searching a trackless sea for a home that forgot him. Nearly 3 millennia ago, a particular ordering of these images crystallized into the Odyssey as we know it. But before that, the Homeric material was formless, fluid, its elements shuffled into new narratives like cards in a deck. Echoes of the other Odysseys survive in Hellenistic friezes, on Cycladic funerary urns, and in a pre-Ptolemaic papyrus excavated from the desiccated rubbish mounds of Oxyrhynchus. This last contains 44 concise variations on Odysseus' story that omit stock epic formulae in favor of homing a single trope or image down to an extreme of clarity. I hope that this translation reflects the haunted light of Homer's older islands, where the familiar characters are arranged in new tableaus, but soon become restless, mercurial. They turn their backs, forget their names, move on. This is Chapter 1, A Sad Revelation. Odysseus comes back to Ithaca in a little boat on a clear day. The familiarity of the east face of the island seems absurd. Bemused, he runs a tricky rip current he has not thought about in 15 years, and lands by the mouth of a creek where he swam as a boy. All his impatience leaves him, and he sits under an oak he remembers, whose branches overhang the water, good for diving. 20 years have gone by, he reflects. What are a few more minutes? An hour passes in silence, and it occurs to him that he is tired and might as well go home. So he picks up his sword and walks toward his house, sure that whatever obstacles await will be minor compared to what he's been through. The house looks much as it did when he left. He notices that the sheep beer's gate has been mended. A rivulet of smoke rises from the chimney. He steals lightly in, hand on sword, thinking how ridiculous it would be to come so far and lose everything in a moment of carelessness. Within, Penelope is at her loom, and an old man drowses by the fire. Odysseus stands in the doorway for a while before Penelope notices him and shrieks, dropping her shuttle, and before she draws another breath, running and embracing him, kissing him and wetting his cheeks with her tears. "Welcome home," she says into his chest. The man by the fire stands up looking possessive and pitifully concerned, and in an intuitive flash Odysseus knows that this is her husband. The idea is absurd. The man is soft, grey, and heavy, no hero and never was one, would not have lasted an hour in the blinding glare before the walls of Troy. He looks at Penelope to confirm his guess and notices how she has aged. Her hips wider, her hair more grey than not, the skin around her eyes traced with fine wrinkles. Without the eyes of homecoming, there is only an echo of her beauty. She steps back from him and traces a deep scar in his shoulder, and her wonder and the old man's fear become a mirror. He realizes that with his blackened skin, tangled beard, and body lean and hard from years of war, he looks like a reaver, a revenant, a wolf of the sea. Willfully composed, Penelope puts her hand on his shoulder and says that he is most welcome in his hall. Then her face collapses into tears, and she says she did not think he was coming back, had been told he was dead these last 8 years, had given up a long time ago, had waited as long as she could, longer than anyone thought was right. He had spent the days of his exile imagining different homecoming scenarios, but it had never occurred to him that she would just give up. The town deserted, his house overrun by violent suitors, Penelope dying or dead and burned, but not this. Such a long trip, he thinks, and so many places I could have stayed along the way. Then, mercifully, revelation comes. He realizes that this is not Penelope. This is not his hall. This is not Ithaca. What he sees before him is a vengeful illusion, the deception of some malevolent god. The real Ithaca is elsewhere, somewhere on the sea roads, hidden. Giddy, Odysseus turns and flees the tormenting shadows. This is Chapter 6, Penelope's Elegy, which is a second homecoming. Odysseus set foot on Ithaca, trembling with wrath, his spear poised to fly through the heart of the first man unwise enough to cross him. He passed unopposed up to his old hall, where instead of enemies he found his kinsmen turning to face him with wide eyes, exclaiming in wonder. He first thought it was a war cry and nearly slew them. They drew him in among them, touching and praising him, all astonishment and delight except for Penelope, whose face had been the ground for the figure of his dreams, hardly aged and oddly quiet, lingering alone at the back of the crowd. He pushed his way through to her and reached out to touch her cheek, but she evaded him, and the crowd looked away, suddenly quiet, and Odysseus was aware that he had blundered. The next day they showed him her grave. For the rest of his time on Ithaca, Odysseus avoided looking at her as she lingered in his house, staring out the window and idly running her fingertips over familiar things. He mastered his desire to seize her legs and to kiss her thighs and hands, for he knew that she would turn to ash and shadow as soon as he touched her, and moreover, nothing is more disgraceful than to acknowledge the presence of the dead. Okay? Has it? Yes. I guess that worked. This is the shortest chapter, and in some respects, my favorite. Chapter 14, Fragment. A single fragment is all that survives the 45th book of the Odyssey. Odysseus, finding that his reputation for trickery preceded him, started inventing histories for himself and disseminating them wherever he went. This had the intended effect of clouding perception and distorting expectation, making it easier for him to work as he was wont, and the unexpected effect that one of his lies became, with minor variations, the Odyssey of Homer. 27, No Man's Wife. In his sojourn in the land of the dead, Odysseus sought Penelope among the listless shades. With his broadsword he cleared a path through the muttering ghosts, but she receded, seeming not to see him. He called out her name and chased after her, leaving his men behind, catching up with her in a dark glade full of asphodel where she sat at a loom weaving a long shroud. He made to speak to her, but, remembering the ways of the dead, used his sword to dig a small pit over which he opened a vein. She was drawn to the blood and drank, something like light coming into her eyes. It is no kindness to bring the dead back to themselves. We are wretched, but do not know it until you remind us. Why have you come to trouble me, stranger? She said, looking up from where she knelt in the dust with red streaks on her white face. I am a traveler from Troy who has come a long way with Odysseus, your husband, he said. What cruel fate befell you that the deep-thinking hero must now return to a cold and empty hall? You lie, she said apathetically. Odysseus is no more. When he had been gone 10 years and a little more, I went to Delphi to learn what had become of him. I gave the priest a silver bowl embossed with sphinxes that had been part of my dowry. He led me down into a cave dark as a womb, where it smelled of whetstone and hot metal. I asked the shuddering oracle, whom I heard but could not see, whether Odysseus would come back to me. No man will return to you, but not for a long while, she said, and all my hope fell to the floor. Back in Ithaca, many men sought my hand. I told them I would marry when I had finished my husband's funeral shroud, and I kept weaving it and weaving it. They grew impatient, they pled and reasoned, but were working themselves up to violence. I wanted to secure my son's patrimony, so I sent Telemachus off to visit Sparta, and when he was gone gave a feast, to which I made a point of inviting every man who had courted me. I let it be known that by the end of the feast I would be with the man who would be my husband. The wine was poisoned, painful and slow, but sure. And I drank first, and so I made a liar of myself, for though I have searched every vale of the Shadowlands, I have not found even a rumor of him. Would you know your husband? Do you not recognize me at all? Asked Odysseus gently. Yes, I recognize you. You are the living, come with all your heat and blood to trouble my shadows and dust. Traveler, be gone from here. But I must come back once more when my days are done, and then, finally, you will be waiting for me, he said, and reached out to touch her cheek, but she slipped away like a fish in a stream. This is chapter 31, Athena in Death. An arrow, a reaver, a ship, a wave, a cold swell, a white fog. Death was destined to come from the sea for Odysseus Laertides, and in the fullness of time it did. He had often meditated on the form it would take, and thought he had considered and prepared himself against every sea-born end. But in the event, dying was confusing, a jumble of impressions of foam and blood and long empty vistas. He was relieved to see that Athena, who had abandoned him for decades, and, he had thought, for good, was there to greet him, and gather him to her breast. He had never before been this close to her, never touched her. Her skin was very hot, and she smelled like metal and summer. She grinned at him like she had when they were plotting an especially pernicious piece of mischief, and said she had been waiting for him a long time, poised for the moment when his thread would be cut, and she would swoop down from Olympus to catch his soul before it could start the long trip into the dark. The underworld was not for him, not even its Elysium, she said. For Odysseus, her best beloved among mortals, her favorite since he was born, she would, as his final reward, make for him whatever afterlife he wanted. Odysseus thought a little while, or possibly a long while. He was distantly aware of nights passing, greenery sprouting from oak trees and withering away, through all of which Athena's grin was immovable. And asked to be young again, or at least not old, and to spend eternity making his way from a war indefinitely far in the past to an island indefinitely far in the future. He would remember that the war had been painful, but that he had won it. The details of the island would be vague. Splintered images would come from time to time, but he would be certain that it represented the consummation of every desire. He did not want to know that he was a ghost. Let trials and cruel kings and monsters come, he said, and let them all be overcome at the last second. Above all, he said, stay with me this time. She would, she said, and she had. Athena granted his request. Moreover, as she knew full well that the age of heroes was fading like an ember, she turned her back on Mount Olympus and went with him. Much as she dotes on him, her mind sometimes wanders and she looks back in on Earth. When this happens, a certain comet passes through the constellation Orion for the space of 7 days before slipping back out into the great night. My grandfather was privileged to observe this rare celestial phenomenon and averred that his grandfather before him had seen it in his youth. Let's see, I guess I'll do one or two more. It's been about half an hour of reading, which usually exhausts my attention as an audience member. Unless they're all much more robust than I am, they'll be getting tired too. Chapter 33, Cassandra's Rule. So the last event I did was this event that paired poets and me, the token fiction writer, with wines. And I read last, and with each new poet there would be a new glass of wine. And thus I had a very drunk audience, which I have to say was a remarkable experience, because most audiences will listen very politely, and that's very well, but you feel a little like you're reading into an abyss. But these people are drunk enough that they would laugh at the laugh lines and laugh at non-laugh lines, and on the whole, be incredibly responsive. So it had occurred to me to have an open bar for all future readings. But I didn't plan ahead enough, and probably it would have been wildly illegal and against college policy. But still, there are certain advantages to it. In any case, if you'd like to imagine that you're drunk, that would perhaps be helpful. In any case, Chapter 33, Cassandra's Rule. Running from her brother through the old city in the early morning, when the shadows were sharp and her skin iridescent in the sun, she found a refuge in the temple of Apollo. Within, it was dark and cool, and the silence was a comfort. She lay down and put her head on her arms, watching the statue of the god, who seemed lost in thought. She fell into that middle sleep where everything is gray stillness, and stayed there until the gray coalesced into a beautiful man speaking softly of an island full of cattle whose death would be many men's undoing, of a mother wading in the river Styx and holding her infant son by the heel that would one day blossom into his ruin, of the inexorable tightening of fate's net. She woke up and found Apollo regarding her thoughtfully. He said, "Never mind, no one will ever believe you." Thereafter, whenever she looked at the sun long enough, she could hear Apollo as he talked to himself, a slow, endless monologue touching on all things under his far-reaching gaze, and in that way she knew the future. With staring, sun-blind eyes, she learned the sad ends of Hector, her brother, and Priam, her father, and wept for them even as they sat beside her. She begged them to flee, to pray, to stay inside on inauspicious days, but they only smiled, kissed her, brushed her aside. She saw that the war that was coming to Troy could not be won, that it could only end in flame and fields sown with salt, but no one would be persuaded. She heard her own fate, to warn but be disbelieved, to inveigh against the horse as it was pulled through the city gates, finally to be a slave in a distant country. She thought of fleeing, but knew from the fall of the city wall's shadow, from the voice of the wind sighing through the towers, and from the shapes of the bright clouds overhead, always changing, that it would not be so, that her fate was elsewhere, that for once the god had lied. We'll do one more, sort of longer and more narrative, and then that should be good. Chapter 26, Blindness. I could have lived among light and ambrosia, bright forever young things coming and going on each other's arms, and the wine and the night inexhaustible. But that world was flat to me, and for all that my father is great among them, I wanted no part of it. Even if she had been true, I am not considered handsome, never have been, I think I would have preferred my island, my farm, and my solitude. I have never had the island altogether to myself, but I made my neighbors dislike me from the first. From time to time, a farm wife dropped by, as in duty bound, but I offered no more than politeness required, or a little less, to ensure my privacy. Sometimes in the distance, I heard a girl's sweet singing, and I needed no more company. I lived in a cave, as it was easier than a proper house, cool in summer and warm in winter. I tended my goats, made cheeses, split firewood, and fished. I fancied myself a philosopher, although for the most part my philosophizing consisted of staring out to sea, usually with a fishing pole in my hand, thinking of nothing. The sun would bore into my brain over the hours and drive out everything except a ringing brightness, making everything look hollow or flat. One day I came home and found my cave full of visitors. They had been regaling themselves on my larder and greeted me with swollen-cheeked, stupidly beaming faces, their lips greasy with my mutton, invoking the formulas of guest friendship and waiting for their welcome. I gave them no welcome but curses and, still sunstruck and sea-addled, hit one of them with my staff. I only meant to scare him, but I have always been strong, and he fell and knocked his head on the wall with the sound of a stone landing at the bottom of a deep well. They would have taken him and gone, or tried to. My blood was up. But their captain, who had a face full of guile, begged my pardon, apologized for the intrusion, called me lord, and with all humility proffered a skinful of strong wine as a belated host gift. It had been a long time since I had tasted wine, and I was a little mollified, not to mention ashamed of myself for overreacting. We sat down to drink, and for the sake of politeness, I asked them who they were and where they came from. The captain said his name was Nobody, a strange moniker, I thought at the time, but it would have been unseemly to comment, and that he and his men had sailed from Crete to trade for amber and linen, but on their way had found nothing but trouble. Pirates of opportunity, perilous storms, comrades washed overboard in the night, and their course lost these many months past. Nobody droned on about his adventures, and sleep came to me as I sat watching him across the fire. How painful it is that his sly fox face was the last thing I ever saw. I woke to blood and agony and darkness. Staggering to my feet, I lashed out and felt my fist connect with resilient flesh. I put my hands around the spear with which I had been mutilated. Vitreous humor trickled down my face, and I knew with nauseous certainty that I would never see again. I drew out the spear and lay about with it, feeling their bones crack through the shaft. I bellowed and pressed the attack, not caring if I blundered into an outstretched sword. Commotion, hoarse panicked voices, and motion in every direction. With mortal intent, I made a mighty thrust toward the closest whisper, but struck the wall. The spear broke in two, and I was left holding a fragment of the haft, just big enough for a torch. I stopped and listened. It was silent, but for my heart and my breathing. They had gone. I put my hands to my ruined face, then bound the wound as best I could, and staggered down the steep path to the sea. I thought I heard their oars on the water and raged at them, wading out into the surf, flailing at the waves, finding stones by touch and hurling them. I might have heard nobody's voice, but with the breakers and my shouting, I could not be sure. They were gone, and I got cold. I was not quite brave enough to drown myself. I shouted for my father. I did not love him much, but he knew his duty, and I thought he would avenge me. If he heard me, he gave no sign. I crept back to my cave, and the pain, which had been waiting at a distance, engulfed me. Fever came. I lay by the fire, chilled to the bone, too weak even to go to the well. At first the fever was low, and I was transcendently calm, and thought I had at last found true philosophy. As the fever rose and rose, I started to shake uncontrollably. A young man with golden hair appeared, standing patiently in the shadows, watching me, leaning on a staff around which snakes twined. Of course, if there had been such a man, I would not have seen him. In the dream, as the pain deepened, he came more and more into the light, and I thought he would speak to me, but just then my father arrived and sent him away. He laid his vast hand on my forehead, as cool as the deeps of the sea, and I told him that it was nobody who did this to me and must die. The fever broke soon after that, and I lay awake and alone in my cave, facing a future of darkness. I groped in the dust and found cheeses, my staff, a bucket, the empty wineskin, the cold ashes of the fire, a pile of furs, and the sharp end of the spear that had blinded me, still sticky with dried blood and matter. I sat down, and I think I would not have got up again if not for my goats, who butted their heads against me and clamored to be milked. This I managed to do, and then shooed them off to the pasture and laid out their salt while they bleated and had their little quarrels. The days were long, and there was no sun to dazzle me. I wondered incessantly about the man who had brought me a sack of wine, a tale, and a blindness. In my mind, I replayed everything he had said, trying to reconstruct each tone and nuance. He had not uttered a single true word, of course, but we are revealed in our lies. His and his men's clothes had been thrice-patched stuff, but their helmets and arms were keen-edged and mirror-polished. They had carried their arms with a total casualness, their weapons extensions of themselves, like veterans old in war. They had accents, the like of which I had never heard before, so I reckoned nobody and his men must be from far away, out toward the edge of the world. My hatred of nobody was impotent and all-encompassing. I wanted to be free of it, but always my mind went back to him. I told myself and the goats stories about him. He and his men were pirates from Corsica, vicious raiders out to prey on anyone they could overwhelm or surprise. The next, they were a party of pilgrims bound for Delphi who had stopped on my island for water and found me only through misfortune. But their ragged clothes and gleaming weapons, their hardness and loneliness and hunger made me decide in the end that they were coming back from a long, bloody war, fought far from home, a war that left them with eyes as blank and hostile as birds of prey, raiding and killing as the opportunity arose, knowing no life but arms and no law but violence. I invented perils for his trip home, horrors rising up from the deep sea, the endless asphodel fields of the dead, sweetly singing witches to gull and bind him, but I could never quite bring myself to finally close the sea over his head or the jaws on his throat. Always I pulled him back, unwilling to let him escape into death. As his trials mounted, all of which scarred him, took some vital piece of him, I needed him alive, not whole. I saw that he must have some good reason to go on living, for, as I have often reflected, it is a simple thing to give oneself up to the sea. So I gave him an island like mine, not good for much, but raising goats and men, and a wife of perfect steadfastness, the mirror image of the woman I knew so long ago. In retrospect, it is obvious that nobody was the nom de guerre, the alias of an anonymous raider. The choice of sobriquet suggests a man infatuated with his own cleverness. He carried himself like a warrior, but preferred getting me drunk to attacking me openly. His mind, I thought, must be like a city of 1,000 twists and turns, bounded on deceit, with never an open line of sight or a straight passage. Fluent in lies, he must have been the death of many men greater than himself. And he was loyal to his men, or so I liked to think, as it increased my pleasure in making monsters pluck them from his ships while he stood by helplessly, and in making their ghosts weep for burial. The island farmers are less timid now that I am blind. They bring me fruit and salted meat, and listen with more than polite interest while I tell my stories. Some parts of the tale have gelled over the years, though others I improvise or vary as suits the audience's mood or mine. Even now it gives me pleasure to invent new sufferings for him. For all that, my bloodthirstiness is lessened. I no longer groan in my sleep or dream of catching him and wrenching out his bones. The ruin where my eye was is not painful anymore, and my days are calm, even joyful. Sometimes I think I am grateful that sight would be a distraction. And that's it for the reading. Thank you. Any questions? Someone has to have a question. Does anybody have a question but is too abashed to ask it? Deborah.
Hi, nice to see you again. I just get a conversation going here. I'm just curious about how you came up with this idea when you first read the Odyssey. Just a little bit about sort of the germination of this idea.
Good question. I read the Odyssey first when I was 12, and I don't think I've reread it since then, actually. I actually made a point of not rereading it when I was writing this book, since I wanted to work with the memory traces that were left after the book had been sort of boiled down into its essential elements in memory over the course of decades, which seemed sort of truer to my intent than being immediately conversant with all of the details or the particularities of Homer's phrasing or the like. And as far as where the idea came from, I'm not really sure anymore. So I started writing when I was 19, and I didn't tell anybody about it for about a decade. So I accumulated many, many notebooks full of material, and I'd started various books, and then they sort of died or didn't go anywhere. And at one point I decided that if I was actually going to do this, I had to do a book. So I was looking through my notebooks, and I found a handful of things that I liked. And taken together, they sort of implied lost books. So it had been implicit, but not explicit, in what I'd been doing for many years.
Could it have been a different book that you did what you did with the Odyssey?
You mean sort of making a few ghosts of other ancient text?
Why that? You read it a long time ago, and it must have made a strong impression. But what about the book? Could it have been a different book?
That's a good question. I think that one of the reasons the Odyssey appealed to me was that it has such strong elemental imagery. So a man in this sort of fairy archipelago leaving a war behind him and going back to a home that forgot him, where there's a wife of, in the event, perfect steadfastness, waiting, seems very simple and very powerful. It seems like even if you lose the poetry of the original composition, just the structure and the imagery are sufficient for a very powerful work. So there are lots of potential other candidates, but I've never really considered anything except the Odyssey. It seemed like a natural choice. And there's this Borges story of the Gospel according to Mark, in which there's a throwaway line to the effect that mankind has always been, or in Western culture, there have been two stories for the last few thousand years. One is about a god nailed to executed on a hill, and another is about a man lost at sea trying to get home. So that kind of stayed with me, the idea of the Odyssey as a fundamental sort of icon story. After I finished this book, I had decided that I would never again rewrite a classic, which resolution I've been violated because now I'm doing a vaguely analogous redaction of Ovid's Metamorphoses. So I guess that's another potential candidate. Anyone else? Don't be shy. Yes?
Well, I'm just curious how your I teach in computer science, and I'm kind of curious about your computer science background and how that led you away from computer science. Do you have two sides to your mind that you're kind of expressing the part of it that you can express in computer science, or how do you sort of reconcile those two parts of computer science?
Good question. So I feel like what I'm doing with literature and what I want to do with AI aren't that different. Well, my usual answer to that kind of question is that math, which computer science is more or less a subset, is all about aesthetics, in that it's easy to find true theorems, but hard to find interesting or beautiful theorems. And it's the interestingness and the beauty that it's really all about. And so I do have a CS life outside of, or in parallel with my lit life. So I work for startups in Silicon Valley, and then hopefully going back to academia sometime in the relatively near future. As far as how they interact, I don't know. Not that much. They're both pattern languages. I once wrote a simulated annealing program to organize the chapters in the lost books, but I ended up throwing it out. I have no pithy response, unfortunately.
As you were saying, I was thinking of how code is divided into methods and functions and things like that, and perhaps each of your stories is kind of a functional block that builds up a little larger software structure.
So The thing about programs, at least with the way programming languages work today, is that they're achingly precise. That's kind of one of the beauties of writing a program. You have to know exactly what you're doing. There's no room for self-deception or uncertainty. And with the way the Lost Books works, the chapters do interact in various ways, but there are lots of potential patterns you could extract from them. And there's no one pattern that explains everything, and many of the patterns contradict each other. But you can find lots of threads and linkages going through them. So it would certainly be interesting if there was a computational structure that could express this kind of thing. I guess it's a little bit like multiple inheritance. And,
Sort of an odyssey that, by the efforts of trying to do that, kept them pretty back on the path. Perhaps one that we might to Homer's Odyssey.
If the search for AI is an odyssey, then it's still on the beach, and people are trying to find the sails, or I don't know, maybe they've got some logs and a saw, and they're trying to write a blueprint. Certainly, it's an extraordinarily hard problem, and I think a compelling one that if it ever actually exists, it will change the world radically, in much the same way that the Industrial Revolution does. But there's no particular risk of that happening anytime soon. I suppose it's a little bit analogous in that it's something important to work toward. It's very far away and seemingly unlikely to get much closer. And involves a lot of cleverness. Yeah.
What do you make of the other adaptations of the Odyssey? They mentioned Joyce or Cassandra. Have you read them?
I've read some of them. There's a huge number of works, so I can't claim to have read all, or even the major ones. I've never managed to read Joyce's Ulysses cover to cover, to my enduring shame. But then again, Borges didn't either, so there's a precedent.
Joyce may not have read it cover to
Let's see. I've seen miscellaneous Odyssey direct works, O Brother, Where Art Thou, and that kind of thing. I thought they were interesting, but I can't say I drew on them to any great extent. And as long as we're talking about Joyce, I have yet to make it off the first page of Finnegan's Wake, although I think I must have tried 4 or 5 times now. I eventually decided that it was meant for another class of reader. Sorry, yes?
I was just going to ask what you do choose to read.
Oh, let's see. So I reread a lot. Every now and then I feel intrepid and head up to the bookstore or the book section of the New York Times to try to find whatever bold young authors are doing great work today. And I'm usually disappointed and go back to reading Patrick O'Brien and Joan Didion and Bret Easton Ellis and Italo Calvino and Borges and Virginia Woolf and that sort of thing. I think I've read those authors so much that all of their books are very familiar to me. So it's like walking a well-trodden path, going through their books.
So the books that you mentioned that you like are thought to be postmodernist. Do you think of your work as particularly postmodernist or not necessarily?
So I certainly didn't sit down and think, what kind of novel would be a good thing to write? A postmodern one. But that said, if I were a literary scholar classifying the Lost Books, it seems pretty obvious that it goes in the postmodern bucket. And they're not all postmoderns. I mean, Patrick O'Brien is a traditional teller of tales. Anyone else? Yes?
So many questions, but one of them that really interests me is process for you as a writer. Being in mathematics, things are pretty exact, and they have a pretty exact beginning, middle, and end. And I'm familiar with the process of writing can be pretty messy. And how were you able to deal with those two divergent processes and continue your work. Was it difficult to do that?
So it was certainly very difficult to write the book. I mean, it was about, 10 PhD theses worth of difficult. But not in the sense of this is unlike mathematics and computers and thus threatening, just in the sense of it was an immense amount of effort. As far as how my process goes, I write many, many drafts, and I have a very clear idea of whether language works or it doesn't. And it's very hard to get it to work, but once it does, it's pretty obvious that it does, and then it becomes stable. So I mostly worry at it endlessly until it feels right. I feel like prose has a sort of texture, so it's like running your hand over a piece of metal, say, and I want the metal to be smooth. So if there are jags or rough spots, then I feel them and recoil and have to make that right. I feel kind of like a story is a piece of metal that I'm working, and it gets hotter as I reread it. So if I reread it 10 times, then what was once this sort of unapproachable artifact becomes hot and malleable, and then I can make changes in some meaningful way. Also, the kind of computational thing I'm interested in is perhaps closer to literature than almost any other kind of quantitative pursuit, in that I'm interested in computational models of semantics. So how do we algorithmically model what words mean, and how do we algorithmically model the way the meanings of words are combined? So sometimes this will be in the back of my mind when I'm working on a sentence and trying to figure out why it doesn't seem quite right. So it's kind of an interesting perspective. Also, I think I'm probably one of about 5 writers in the world who writes in the Emacs text editor. And I'm pretty sure I'm the only one in the world who composes using LaTeX, which is this text processing language that quantitative academics use to write papers generally. Yes? Yes?
And along those lines, it seems to me that there's sort of almost an ancientness coming out of your language. There's almost like a universal ancient ring to it. And do you think that it comes from that algorithmic approach, or do you think that's just sort of something that naturally came?
I think it comes from trying to wash away everything that's contingent. What I'm going for in prose is something that doesn't feel like me, that is devoid of any personal imprimatur, that in some way is a way of expressing something like that. So I'm glad that came through. Yes?
I'd be interested in analyze as an AI researcher, how you think as a writer, when you have a sentence or you get expressed when it is right. The artist knows when it's wording or sort of not right. What do you think is?
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting question. Let's see. So words have selectional preferences. There are certain kinds of other terms they prefer to go with in certain ways. So like you drink liquids, but probably not, I don't know, a vertebrate. And that's a really coarse example. Most words have subtle and complex selectional preferences, I think. And the goodness of a sentence is, or the grammaticality of a sentence is to some extent the respect to which those preferences are respected. So it's not the case that a sentence is either grammatical or ungrammatical. There are degrees of grammaticality, which you learn if you study linguistics. And I think that what that reflects is that there are many, many constraints to be respected, and a grammatical-ish sentence is one that has most of the constraints respected, but not all of them. So that's largely syntactic. I think that there are also semantic, well, more semantic and less syntactic selection of preference restrictions that are sort of encoded in the aura of connotation of a word. And it's the extent to which these things are satisfied that, in a computational sense, is whether a sentence feels right.
Is it possible as an AI researcher that one day that can be achieved? Like, I guess in the same frame, you can know whether a sentence can be funny or not. Mixing our words, grammatically it's funny, the punch is there or it's not there. Sometimes you know it. As a writer, it's like something like you look at the sentence or fine, but you know it's funny. It doesn't work. I think it's actually possible to quantify that.
So yes and no. Well, yes and no. The first yes, in that in the limit, it's certainly possible. The brain is just a physical artifact. You can simulate physical artifacts computationally. In fact, you can probably simulate the important properties of the brain at a fairly coarse level. And also, there is an articulable algorithmic character to the way things like humor and, I think, aesthetics works. What's hard, though, is all the things that are easy for people. So embodiment and a sensory experience of the world are things we take for granted that somebody with a cognitive impairment or a 2-year-old can do without any effort, that are virtually impossible to replicate computationally. So really that's the traditional problem of AI. It seemed promising in the 50s because you could get computers to do things that engineers thought were impressive, like play chess and solve theorems and that kind of thing. But creating a robot that could walk across the room, or a system that could analyze an image of, say, this room and pick out the people on the chairs and different lighting conditions and so forth, is almost unthinkably complex. And in order to have an understanding of human literature, you would need to be able to do all of those things. And that kind of an artifact is infinitely far away for the time being.
One of those lines, in his introduction, Dave Hunt said, you had written somewhere or spoken that you think the heart is sort of ultimately knowable. And yet you say artificial intelligence is sort of almost impossible. So how do you reckon those two?
Artificial intelligence is definitely possible. It's just very, very, very hard. So when I say infinitely remote, I just mean really, really remote, which is still finite, a whole lot smaller than infinity. An answer exists. It's just that with currently available technology, we have no way of getting to it. In the limit of no clever people coming along and guessing how the mind works computationally, presumably one day we'll understand how the brain works on a neuron-by-neuron level and be able to simulate that and reverse engineer it to some extent. So certainly I think eventually this will be a solved problem. It's just so far in the future that it's like, I don't know, discussing jet aircraft in the 1700s. I actually think that AI, as it exists today, is a lot like, say, physics was in the 1600s, and that you've got some good work going on, but it's lost in this morass of people studying phlogiston and the humors and the like. And, there were impressive people with impressive credentials from major universities studying Aristotelian physics, which, of course, was a complete waste of time. Deborah?
I feel like I'm a little out of it in this whole conversation, but there's been something of an assumption or a sort of a placing next to each other of literature and math, let's say. And you're an interesting, I think part of the thing that's interesting about your book and the success of it and all of that in your life is that you seem to combine those two, and we sort of, or the world thinks that's sort of unusual. I've heard that before about math and aesthetics and beauty. A beautiful theorem, that kind of thing. Okay, get it, but I believe you on that. So my question sort of is, are you like weird, or are there lots of people like you? Or the other way I was sort of thinking about it is, so there you are in Silicon Valley. Are there, do people look at you and like, you wrote a book? I mean, you're on the bestseller list, or you see what I'm trying to get?
Yes. So the answers to your questions were yes, yes, and yes, respectively. There are other people like me. I mean, there are a lot of computer people who go home and happily play World of Warcraft until it's time to go to bed and get up to go to the office again. But there's also a good chunk who are well-read, eclectic polymaths, and they're always kind of fun. That said, people who are scientists as well as artists who have gotten some traction are quite rare. I can only think of a handful who are working these days. There's Alan Lightman, who was a physicist, but now I think he's just a writer. There's some material scientist at MIT who does a remarkably good impression of MFA-style fiction. And there's David Eagleman, who's a neuroscientist who wrote a book about possible afterlives. That was kind of interesting. And do people think I'm weird in Silicon Valley? Probably yes. I'm planning on leaving pretty soon.
Follow up on that for a second, because I feel like there's a little bit of a disconnect, at least. I think I'm more with the woman who just spoke than the other gentleman. I guess my question is, your work is, quite lyrical from the reading, and yet the introduction, and you seem to assert that the mind is just a glorified computer, and there is no such thing as intuitive knowledge or soul. So I just don't really see how those two things, as it were, compute. And I'm wondering whether or not, I'm questioning exactly your sincerity, but do you really believe that? Or is it a rhetorical ploy for the sake of literary argument of some sort?
I think I can shed light on that. So, taking the phrase, or the sentence, the mind is just a computer, I agree with everything except just. No. So, if you go deep enough into physics and computer science, then it seems natural for there to be multiple levels of description. So like you see a human being and you think of them as a human being with a personality and intentions and the like. But then you look closer and then you see it through the eyes of biology, and they're a composite of cells interacting in a certain way. And then you look more closely at the cells, and now chemistry is the right level of description. And then you look at the individual chemicals, and now physics is a more appropriate description. And then you look even lower, and a different stroke of physics is a more appropriate description. And which one of these levels of description is correct? Well, all of them are correct. They're just suitable for different things. And is it degrading to the topmost level, where the person is a human being with ambitions, ideas, a personality, and so forth, to say that, well, actually, if you go far enough down, they're just made out of these unperson-like elementary particles? Not really. I mean, they have to be made out of something. And really, all it amounts to, when I say that the mind is a computer, is that there is pattern in the way their most fundamental elements of which the person or the brain is made interact. Really, it could hardly be anything else. And you could be a mystic, I suppose, but even if you are a mystic, you have to then wonder, well, what are the rules by which souls or ghosts or whatever interact with the world? I mean, it's not patternless, clearly, and if there's a pattern, there's probably some kind of formally articulable pattern if you go deep enough. So no, I'm not being insincere, and I'm not just taking a rhetorical stance. For me, saying that something is computational is not especially value-laden. Indeed, it's completely value neutral, although I can see how it might seem like it would be if the machines you're used to interacting with are Microsoft Word and your toaster and the like. And you think, my God, this guy is saying that I'm like this toaster or this crummy Microsoft product? This is ridiculous. In fact, saying that something is a computer is just saying that at its most abstract level, the way it evolves over time is predictable.
Except your assertion, I just still a little hung up on the idea that if you say in your work you're trying to get away from yourself, how you work up against the problem that your work is inexpressibly an expression of yourself.
I don't know if I'm trying to get away from myself. I'm trying to write something I'd like to read, really. That was my essential motivation and criteria for success. I would imagine that I had not written my book, but found it in a used bookstore, and would I like it if I did? I'm pretty sure I would, so I guess that worked out. Or maybe I'm just flattering myself, I don't know. It's hard to do the experiment.
I wonder if you would mind going back to the question about mathematics and beauty, and I think you suggested that you have a sense of an appreciation for an elegant proof. And I'm wondering how you would describe an elegant or a beautiful proof, and is there any correlation with how you would describe a beautiful or good work of literature? Is the criteria for beauty in mathematics, I guess, similar to the criteria for beauty, or however you want to term it, excellence in literature?
Good question. I think that there's some literature that has more of a mathematical character for me than others, and that good math is always dense. You're trying to find the smallest little set of ideas that generate a whole universe of mathematical objects around them and give you the most explanation for the least number of assumptions and the like. So there's always this extreme emphasis on compactness. And some literature is like that. I don't know, certain Borges stories, say. But some literature isn't like that at all. Like, I don't know, a 1,000-page Russian novel probably can be accused of too much compactness. Although I've often thought it would be interesting to see what kinds of mathematics other kinds of minds would come up with. Like, our minds are only so big. We can only keep so much in memory at a given time. So what if our minds were, say, 10,000 times as big? Would we invent essentially the same mathematics? Could we find very theorems that would be 1,000 pages long and very elegant and compact by our standards, with this whole other world of objects to open up to us? Yes?
So when you talk about brain and mind, are you talking about intelligence and consciousness, and is that measurable? I know I don't think anybody's come to that conclusion yet, that it's measurable, but is anybody trying to measure what is intelligence or describe that? And is that considered to be mind or brain in your...
Let's see. So science generally agrees that intelligence is entirely in the brain, or in any case in the nervous system. As far as consciousness, it's hard to say anything definitive, or indeed to say anything at all about consciousness, which is incredibly frustrating, because here I am being conscious. And being conscious is being conscious. But when I try to make it empirical, or when I try to frame some sort of scientifically rigorous question around consciousness, it becomes impossible. It's what you might call a mystery instead of a problem. So, there are some very hard problems. How do I make an AI? What is a grand unified theory of physics? Where I don't know how to solve them, but I know what a solution would look like. But as far as consciousness goes, what is it, how do I detect it empirically, I have no idea what a solution would look like. I can't even imagine a way of approaching the problem. And thus, it's something to leave for philosophers, in particular Daniel Dennett. What else were you asked?
Intelligence, or even shoot for an artificial intelligence or understanding of that without understanding consciousness as part of that.
So there's a general sense that consciousness is a sort of epiphenomenon of intelligence, that it somehow isn't a central object which the mind is built around, but is this sort of illusion of experience that emerges from the way we process information. And we know how to talk about information processing, but we don't know how to talk about consciousness. That is, we can see how a computation is working, but we don't know if something is conscious or not. Hopefully, what I imagine will happen is that one day there will be artificial intelligences that are sufficiently sophisticated that we'll just take it for granted that they're conscious because we talk to them, they're engaged, and it's obvious that they have mental states and so forth, and thus we'll start to treat them like people and assume that they're conscious. And they might even report consciousness, but it will be a purely informal phenomenon. That may or may not be a satisfactory answer. Anything else?
That Penelope be dead.
Oh, well, sometimes she's dead, and sometimes she's not, and sometimes she's an ordinary human being, and sometimes she's heroic, and sometimes she's a monster. I think I was just exploring variations on what is in some ways one of the most central images in the Odyssey, which is coming home. And certainly coming home to find the object of your ardor has died is a resonant variation for me.
Is a what?
Resonant